flying above the clouds, not floating above them the way we do today, sealed inside a pressurized aluminum tube with recycled air and a screen showing a map, but genuinely, viscerally, almost spiritually above them. Above the noise, above the turbulence, above everything that had ever defined what it meant to travel by air. If you have ever looked out of a small aircraft window and felt a fleeting sense of wonder before the flight attendant handed you a bag of pretzels and the moment dissolved, then you owe it to yourself to understand what it once felt like to cross the sky in something that changed the world and then, without warning, nearly broke it. This is the story of the de Havilland Comet, the first commercial jet airliner ever to carry paying passengers, the aircraft that made Queen Elizabeth, still a young woman newly crowned, look out of a window and fall utterly silent. The machine that shrank the world, rewrote the rules of human travel, and gave a generation its first taste of an experience so refined, so smooth, so unlike anything that had come before, that passengers who flew on it in 1952 spent the rest of their lives trying to describe what it had felt like. Many never quite managed. But this video is not really about the aircraft as a machine. It is about what happened inside it, what passengers heard, and more remarkably, what they did not hear, what they ate, and where they sat, and what they saw when they looked out of those famous oval windows at a world that had never been observed from that height, at that speed, in that silence, before. And it is also about what happened next, because the Comet story does not end in triumph. Or it ends somewhere far more complicated, far more human, and in some ways, far more moving. The question I want to leave with you today is this: was the comet ahead of its time, or was it simply too perfect for the world it was born into? Think about that as we begin. The answer, when we arrive at it, may surprise you. To understand why the comet was so extraordinary, you have to understand what air travel looked like before it arrived. By the late 1940s, the dominant aircraft on long-haul routes was the propeller-driven airliner. The Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-6, magnificent machines in their own right, aircraft that represented the absolute pinnacle of what piston engine aviation could achieve. But flying in them was, by any honest account, an ordeal that required patience, tolerance, and a certain philosophical acceptance of discomfort. The engines, 4 of them, produced a constant, grinding, penetrating vibration that ran through every surface of the aircraft, through the floor, through the armrests, through the very fillings in your teeth. The noise was relentless. Passengers on transatlantic routes arrived exhausted not merely from the hours in the air, but from the sheer physical effort of enduring the sound. Conversation across a table was possible only if you leaned close and raised your voice. Sleep, despite the genuine efforts of the airlines to provide it, was fragmentary and shallow. And then there was the altitude. Propeller aircraft of that era cruised at somewhere between 15 and 20,000 feet. At that altitude, weather systems were not below you. They were around you. And turbulence was not an occasional inconvenience, it was a companion. Passengers on long flights encountered ice clouds, thunderstorm cells, the rolling, lurching discomfort of an aircraft, fighting its way through air that did not particularly want to be crossed. Air sickness was common enough that its management was simply part of the cabin crew's routine duties. This was air travel in 1951. And then de Havilland flew the Comet. And everything changed on a single morning. The de Havilland Aircraft Company had been working on the concept of a jet-powered commercial airliner since 1944, in the final years of the war, when the jet engine itself was barely proven technology. The British government, through the Brabazon Committee, had identified the development of a jet airliner as a national strategic priority, a way to give Britain commercial aviation dominance in the post-war world. De Havilland responded with a design that was, by any standard of the era, visionary. 4 turbojet engines buried cleanly inside the wing roots, a fully pressurized fuselage, large oval windows unlike anything seen on commercial aircraft before, and a cruising altitude of between 35 and 40,000 feet. Where propeller aircraft struggled through weather, the Comet would fly above it. The philosophy was elegant in its simplicity. Go high enough and the atmosphere becomes calm, smooth, almost glassy. Go fast enough and destinations that once required stops and refueling and overnight layovers become manageable in a single sitting. Can you imagine being among the first passengers to understand what that actually felt like in practice? On not reading about it, not being told about it by a travel agent, but sitting in a seat on the 2nd of May, 1952, as BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, operated the world's first scheduled jet passenger service from London Heathrow to Johannesburg, South Africa. Those passengers knew they were making history. BOAC had made sure of it. The tickets were not cheap. A return fare on the Comet in its early service was beyond the reach of anyone but the genuinely wealthy, the senior executives, the diplomats, the aristocrats, the kind of traveler for whom the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth had been, until recently, the natural mode of long-distance transit. These were people with expectations. They were accustomed to being looked after, and de Havilland and BOAC had designed an interior that intended to exceed even those expectations. The cabin of the Comet Mark I accommodated 36 passengers. 36. At a time when the DC-6 might carry 80 or more, this number seems almost extravagant in its restraint. But that restraint was the point. It was not a compromise, it was a statement. The seats were not the narrow, closely packed affairs we have come to accept as the natural condition of air travel. They were wide, generously reclined, upholstered in quality fabrics, separated by a center aisle of meaningful width. There was space around you. There was room to breathe. The windows deserve particular attention because they were not merely functional. They were, in the most literal sense, part of the experience. The Comet's oval windows were significantly larger than those of contemporary piston aircraft, designed deliberately to give passengers a panoramic view of the world outside. At 35,000 feet, that world was unlike anything available to human eyes at the time. This is where one begins to understand that this was a different way of traveling entirely. You could see the curvature of the Earth. Not dramatically, not the way astronauts describe it, but perceptibly, undeniably, as a gentle arc at the horizon that reminded you, in a way nothing had before, of the true shape of the planet you were crossing. The sky above was a blue so deep it approached violet. Below, when there were clouds, they were not a threat to be navigated around but a landscape, a terrain of white and silver and shadow, and extending in every direction like a continent made of light. And the silence. This is the detail that passengers mentioned again and again in the years that followed, the detail that distinguished the Comet experience from every other form of travel they had ever known. Jet engines at cruising altitude produce a different kind of sound than piston engines. They produce a smooth, continuous, low tone, more felt than heard, that at altitude becomes almost inaudible inside a pressurized cabin. Passengers on the Comet's early flights reported, many of them for the first time, that they could hold a normal conversation across a table. A normal, unraised voice, face to face, with a glass of something on the table between you at 35,000 feet, in crossing the Mediterranean or the African continent at nearly 500 miles per hour. The contrast with what they had known before was not gradual. It was absolute. If you are finding this as extraordinary as the people who lived it did, this would be a wonderful moment to leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps the channel and means more stories like this one find their way to the people who would appreciate them. The service on board was, in the language of the era, impeccable. BOAC's cabin crew were trained to a standard that reflected the company's understanding that this was not merely a flight, it was an event. Meals were served on real crockery with real cutlery. The menus on Comet services reflected a commitment to the kind of catering that would not have been out of place in a good London restaurant. Wine was available. Cocktails were available. The galley, compact but functional, was equipped to produce hot meals at altitude, which in 1952 was still something that demanded operational attention and skill. Passengers did not eat from trays balanced on fold-down tables with plastic sporks. They ate from plates, set before them by attentive crew members, in a cabin that was neither loud nor cold nor turbulent. The journey from London to Johannesburg, which had previously required multiple stops and the better part of 2 days, was reduced by the Comet to a still significant but dramatically shortened series of legs. But the character of each of those legs was transformed. The refueling stops at Rome, Beirut, Khartoum, Entebbe, and were not layovers of exhausted endurance, but intervals in an experience that passengers were reluctant to leave. Several early Comet passengers wrote in letters and diary entries that they had been almost disappointed to land, that the aircraft had made the journey itself desirable rather than merely tolerable. That is a remarkable statement about any form of transport, and it was being made about an airplane in 1952. The most surprising thing is that this really happened at the precise moment the world was beginning to imagine such a thing might be possible. The timing of the Comet's arrival felt almost fated. Britain in 1952 was still emerging from the austerity of the post-war years, still rationing certain goods, still carrying the physical and psychological weight of a conflict that had ended only 7 years before. And into that context arrived this aircraft, this improbable, beautiful silver machine, proposing that the future was going to be not merely functional, but genuinely magnificent. The Comet became a symbol in a way that went beyond aviation. It was proof that British engineering and British ambition were not diminished by the war, but transformed by it. Queen Elizabeth II, who had ascended to the throne in February of 1952, just months before the Comet's inaugural service, flew on a Comet that year during a demonstration flight arranged for the royal family. Accounts from those present describe a moment in which the young Queen, seated beside a window, looked out at the world below in sustained silence. Those who were there understood that the silence was not absence of reaction, but the opposite. It was the response of someone who had been genuinely moved by something they had not expected to feel. She was not looking at an aircraft. She was looking at the future. And it was beautiful. Now, if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, this is the moment. Because what comes next is the part of the Comet story that most people have either forgotten or never fully understood. And it changes everything that came before it. By 1953, the Comet had accumulated an extraordinary record of commercial success. BOAC had carried thousands of passengers, the aircraft had performed reliably on routes that had once seemed almost impossibly demanding, and de Havilland had begun deliveries to other airlines, including Canadian Pacific and Air France. The order book was healthy. The future was not merely bright, it appeared to be certain. And then the accidents began. The first loss was a BOAC Comet that crashed on takeoff from Karachi in March 1953 while operating for Canadian Pacific. It was attributed at the time to pilot error during a specific takeoff technique required by the aircraft's characteristics. Serious, but explicable. The second was a BOAC aircraft lost in a storm near Calcutta in May of the same year. Again, a terrible tragedy. But the investigation concluded that severe weather had overwhelmed the aircraft. The pattern was not yet visible. Or perhaps more accurately, those looking did not yet know what to look for. Then came January 10th, 1954. A BOAC Comet, registration GALYP, operating as Flight 781, climbed out of Rome's Ciampino Airport and flew north over the Mediterranean. It reached its cruising altitude, those same 35,000 feet, where everything was so calm, so quiet, so perfectly still. And then it disappeared. The wreckage was eventually recovered from the floor of the Mediterranean, a painstaking and technically demanding operation that represented one of the most significant underwater salvage efforts in history to that point. Enough was recovered to understand that the aircraft had not simply fallen from the sky, it had come apart. The cabin had failed. But why and how remained unclear. BOAC voluntarily suspended Comet services while investigations proceeded. Modifications were made. The aircraft returned to service in March 1954. It was withdrawn again in April 1954. Another Comet had gone down, under circumstances almost identical to the first. What followed was one of the most significant, most meticulous, and ultimately most consequential engineering investigations in the entire history of commercial aviation. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough conducted testing of a scale that had never been attempted. They submerged an entire Comet fuselage in a water tank and cycled the pressure repeatedly, simulating the expansion and contraction that the cabin structure underwent with each pressurization and depressurization cycle during every flight. They were recreating, artificially and at controlled speed, the accumulated stress of repeated flights. Each cycle was one flight, and they found something that no one had fully anticipated, not because the phenomenon was unknown to engineering, but because no one had yet understood its implications for a pressurized aluminum fuselage operating at high altitude with large windows. Metal fatigue. The repeated flexing of the fuselage under pressurization created microscopic cracks that propagated invisibly through the aluminum. The Comet's windows, those beautiful, generous, panoramic oval windows that had given passengers their first view of a curved Earth and a violet sky, had corners. Not sharp corners, but corners nonetheless. And at those corners, stress concentrated and crept and grew, until on a January morning over the Mediterranean, the accumulated stress of a few hundred flights became catastrophic in an instant. The cabin depressurized explosively. The aircraft broke apart at altitude, in the same calm sky where everything had seemed so perfect. Can you imagine being the engineer who understood this? Who sat with the data from that water tank and realized not only what had happened, but why it had been so difficult to prevent? The Comet had not been carelessly designed. It had been brilliantly designed according to everything known at the time about the behavior of pressurized structures. But it was operating in territory that no aircraft had operated in before, at altitudes and speeds, and with window configurations that had never been tested over hundreds of cycles. It was, in the most genuine sense, a pioneer, and it paid the price that pioneers sometimes pay. The certificate of airworthiness for the Comet Mark I was permanently withdrawn. The aircraft never flew commercially again. BOAC's pioneering fleet was gone. De Havilland, which had been the most admired aircraft manufacturer on Earth as recently as 18 months earlier, and found itself at the center of an investigation whose findings were shared openly with the aviation world, including its American competitors. This is where the story becomes something more than aviation history. Because the findings from the Comet investigation were not hidden, not minimized, not buried in proprietary research. The Royal Aircraft Establishment published them. The British government made them available. Every airline, every manufacturer, every regulator on Earth received the benefit of what had been learned at such terrible cost. The oval windows with their stress-concentrating geometry were replaced across the industry with the rounded rectangles we still see today. Fuselage testing protocols were transformed. The understanding of metal fatigue under pressurization cycles became foundational to every commercial aircraft designed in the decades that followed. The Boeing 707, the Douglas DC-8, the aircraft that ultimately carried mass aviation into the modern era, were built with lessons that the Comet had paid for. Boeing flew its first 707 prototype in July 1954, just months after the Comet's final tragedy. They had been watching. They had time to incorporate what the investigation revealed. When the 707 entered commercial service in 1958, the jet age that the Comet had inaugurated finally reached its full expression. But it did so on American aircraft, carrying American passengers for American Airlines at a scale and a price point that transformed air travel from a luxury experience into something approaching a mass market. The irony is quiet but absolute. Britain invented the commercial jet airliner. Britain built the first one. Britain operated it first and learned the hardest lessons at the greatest cost. And then, because those lessons were shared rather than protected, the beneficiary of all that sacrifice was an industry that ultimately left British aviation behind. De Havilland did produce a redesigned aircraft, the Comet 4, which entered service with BOAC in October 1958, just weeks before the Boeing 707. It was a better aircraft in every engineering sense. It was safer, more reliable, more thoroughly understood. BOAC used it to inaugurate the first transatlantic jet service from London to New York in October 1958, beating the 707 across the Atlantic by a matter of weeks. That triumph, real but fleeting, was the last great moment of British commercial jet supremacy. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we come to the end of this story, because this is the part that I think matters most. The passengers who flew on the Comet Mark I in 1952 and 1953, those 36 passengers per flight who sat in wide seats and ate from real plates and looked out of those famous windows at a world that had never been seen that way before, those passengers had an experience that was unrepeatable in every sense. Not merely because the aircraft was withdrawn and never returned to service, but because what it offered was a kind of travel that the industry deliberately moved away from. The economics of mass aviation demanded more seats and lower costs. The Comet's 36-passenger cabin, its unhurried service, its emphasis on the quality of the experience over the quantity of the passengers, was not a viable model for the world the 707 was about to create. So those early Comet passengers were, without knowing it, the last witnesses to a particular vision of what air travel could be. A vision in which the sky was not merely a medium to be crossed, but a destination in itself, in which the silence and the altitude and the smoothness and the view were not incidental features, but the entire point, in which flying above the clouds was not a technical condition, but an experience worthy of the word magnificent. What became of the Comet airframes themselves is, fittingly, a story of quiet endings. The surviving aircraft were used for various purposes, including military reconnaissance variants that served with the Royal Air Force for years afterward. The last commercial Comet variant, the Comet 4C, flew with Dan Air in Britain until 1980, a final late chapter for an aircraft whose first chapter had been so brilliant and so brief. Today, preserved Comet airframes can be seen at the RAF Museum at Cosford and at the de Havilland Aircraft Museum at Salisbury Hall in Hertfordshire, where the original prototype was built. If you ever stand beside one, you will notice first how small it seems compared to the aircraft we fly today. And then you will notice the windows. And if you know the story, you will understand why they look the way they look, and why the windows on every aircraft you have ever flown on look the way they look. They are, in a sense, the Comet's most lasting legacy. A small, rounded rectangle of sky in memory of something larger. If this story moved you the way it moved me in the research, please share this video with someone you know who loves history or aviation, or simply the idea that the world was once full of first times. That is genuinely the best thing you can do for a channel like this one, and it means these stories reach the audience that deserves them. I said at the beginning that I wanted to leave you with a question. Here it is, and I would genuinely love to read your answer in the comments below. If you could have been one of those 36 passengers on any Comet flight in 1952 or early 1953, before any of what came later was known, sitting in that wide seat with a proper meal in front of you and that violet sky above and the curved earth below, now knowing only that you were crossing the sky faster and higher and more quietly than any human being had ever done it before, would you have understood in that moment that you were living something that would never quite exist again? Or do you think, as I sometimes do, that the most extraordinary moments in history are invisible to the people living inside them, and that we only understand what we had when it is already gone? The comet flew for less than 2 years in its original form. It changed the world in ways that outlasted it by decades. It was imperfect in ways that no one yet knew how to measure. And it was, by every account of everyone who flew on it, absolutely, unforgettably beautiful. Flying above the clouds has never quite meant the same thing since.